What is up, Janksters? It's your boy Graham, also known as HamHawks42 on the internet, and today I wanted to talk about some of the weird, unique verbiage that Magic the Gathering players say. Now, this is going to be a relatively quick crash course because there are a ton of slang phrases that have come up throughout Magic the Gathering's history that we use all the time without even really thinking about it. I know I'm very much guilty of this myself, so what I wanted to do was put a video together for folks who are maybe trying to get into Magic, or maybe trying to even just follow along on a Twitch stream and try to understand exactly what's going on within the game, because there are a lot of phrases used very flippantly, very casually amongst the Magic the Gathering community. And to be honest, most of us have forgotten that they're weird phrases because we use them all the time. So that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to touch on a couple of key ones. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments below. I may do more in the future because, like I said, there are a ton of weird slang phrases that we can definitely talk about. But today I wanted to cover some of the basics. And let's start with one that you might hear a lot, especially if you watch people or talk to people who play green specifically, or if you're playing in Commander, and that is ramp. Ramp is an expression that was named after the card Rampant Growth, which is a pretty straightforward spell in that for 2 mana, you go search for a basic land, you put it onto the battlefield. So what you're doing is you're adding lands to your mana base by spending a card to do so, but you get to the mana faster. So what's happened over time is any effect that gives you access to more mana than you would have if you were to just hit your land drops for turn is usually referred to as a ramp action or a ramp effect. Rampant Growth specifically grabs lands. There are other ways to do it, and they've all been kind of adopted under the umbrella of ramp. So if you are gaining access to more mana than you would normally have throughout the course of the game, you are ramping. So when you hear people talk about ramping up, if people are ramping quickly, they're getting access to a lot of mana in various turns, etc. So in order to ramp, you can do it a number of ways. You can land ramp, like Rampant Growth. You can also use cards like Llanowar Elves, which are commonly referred to as mana dorks. I don't know why we all decided to become bullies and call small creatures that aren't relevant in combat dorks. That seems awfully rude to me, but it's caught on. So as a result, if there's a small creature that is not particularly relevant in combat that produces mana upon tapping, like Llanowar Elves, like Birds of Paradise, there are a ton of other ones out there. Actually, 2-drop mana dorks are very, very common. They're usually not as good as the 1-drop ones, of course, but in any event, that's a mana dork. Now, there are also mana rocks, which are usually artifacts that tap to produce mana. These are really only different from mana dorks in the fact that they are not creatures. That's it. Yeah, so that's really, if it is a creature, even if it's an artifact, it's usually referred to as a mana dork rather than a mana rock, because the biggest difference there is mana rocks survive a lot of sweepers. Like if your opponent plays Wrath of God, your mana rocks survive. So that's the idea there. And that's ramp. That's what ramp is. The next word that I'd like to discuss is blinking. Blinking, also referred to as flickering from time to time, is the act of exiling a permanent, oftentimes a creature, but not always, exiling a permanent temporarily and then returning it to the battlefield, sometimes immediately, sometimes at the end of turn. Sometimes I believe even at the beginning of your next turn. Yeah, the timing on the return might vary, but if you cast a spell, oftentimes an instant, sometimes a sorcery, that forces a creature to leave the battlefield temporarily and then come back shortly after, that's referred to as blinking or flickering. I have heard some distinctions that blinking is when it returns immediately and then flickering is when it returns at the end of turn. I don't know how well adopted and well understood that distinction is, so I believe blink and flicker are generally interchangeable, and I believe the term blink was originally coined when Time Spiral came out with the card Momentary Blink, which does exactly that. You remove target creature control from the game, then return to play and return to control. The big benefit with this is if your opponent's trying to target your thing with removal, you can blink it out of the way so it doesn't get touched. Also, if you have an enter the battlefield trigger on that creature, you get to hit it again. Also leaves the battlefield abilities trigger on this too. So very cool effect, very useful, very strong. And yeah, that's blinking. You actually hear a lot about that right now with, as I'm recording this, Brothers War just came out, and you can blink prototype or even unearthed creatures to very good effect. So that's the story there. Next up, burn. This is pretty straightforward. The word burn is used to refer to spells that deal damage. If you're dealing direct damage to a creature or a life total, you know, a player or a planeswalker, it's generally referred to as burn. So if people talk about a burn deck, the main goal of a burn deck is to apply a ton of damage to your opponent's life total through spells. And a lot of time those will also include cards that, you know, increase the amount of damage that's done by spells, or cards that can do additional damage when spells are cast, that kind of thing. So that's burn in a nutshell. A lot of red decks use burn as removal in addition to ways to end the game. Shock right here is a common example. And I don't believe there's a single card that made burn a thing. I think burn was actually pretty quickly adopted as just the word for this action. Yeah. And speaking of just words for actions that have been widely accepted, we also have bounce. That's another one that I want to discuss pretty briefly. Bouncing a permanent is taking a permanent that is currently on the board that presumably somebody paid something for. They either cast it from their hand initially, or they use some kind of resource to get it there, either by producing it as a token, reanimating it from their graveyard, doing any number of things. They got it to the battlefield somehow. Using a bounce spell or bounce effect takes that card from the, or token from the battlefield and puts it back in the hand. In the case of a token, if you bounce a token, it ceases to exist. So be aware of that. So a bounce on a token is as good as a kill spell. But on a card, it's taking a card that's on the battlefield and it's returning it to its owner's hand. This can be used offensively and as a way of temporarily removing your opponent's resources. It can also be used defensively on your own permanents in order to reset them, protect them from board sweepers or targeted removal, that kind of thing. So bounce, it is a term that when I was doing a little bit of research to get this video going, I had forgotten that was a weird word because I use it all the time. And actually, from what I understand, it's even been adopted in other games. It's not just Magic the Gathering exclusive. Like Hearthstone players bounce stuff. So this is pretty widely adopted throughout the TCG space. Next up, we're getting into the ones that are a little more esoteric. They're a little deeper cuts. We have looting. Looting is an action that players can take that requires them to draw a card and then immediately follow that by discarding a card. This is generally considered worse than simply drawing a card because obviously you want to maintain as many cards in your hand as possible to have the most options in any given, situation on the game. However, this does give you the ability to cycle your hand. You can choose you can kind of filter what cards you have access to at any given moment. And you can use this to dig for answers in a specific situation. So that's pretty handy. The other benefit of looting effects is that when you draw a card and then discard a card, you're discarding that card into your graveyard. So if you have cards that can do good things out of the graveyard, possibly be flashed back or reanimated, looting effects put them there. So that's very, very useful. And loot is originally named after Merfolk Looter, and because it has been so widely adopted throughout the community, we also see it on cards like Faithless Looting. Like then the card names are following the colloquial terminology that we've all accepted. This effect is called looting. So I think that's interesting. Flip side of that, there's another effect that is more common in red that's often referred to as rummaging, which is similar to looting. When you loot, you draw a card and then discard a card. When you rummage, you discard the card first and then you draw the card. The reason that that's relevant is you don't get to see the card you draw. When you're looting, you have an opportunity to draw the card, and if the card you just drew is not what you want, you can throw it away and maintain your current hand. When you're rummaging, you have to give up a current resource to get your hands on something that is unknown. So that is a much, it's just genuinely worse. There's no question. If you get the opportunity to either rummage or loot, you generally want to loot. However, certain colors have access to looting effects that others don't. Looting is usually blue, rummaging is usually red, which kind of makes sense. Red is all about acting on impulse and trusting your gut. And so as a result, they're being passionate and very, so as a result, acting on impulse, living in the moment, you have to throw something away before you can get another benefit. It's much more reckless. It's much more impulsive. It's much less measured and calculated. So it kind of fits within the color pie. So that's Rummaging, and it's named after Rummaging Goblin. Next up, we have Mill. Now, Mill is a very interesting situation. It was originally named after Millstone, which was an artifact that could put cards from the top of a player's library into their graveyard. Now, this can be beneficial to the player that owns the effect. So if they want to have a lot of cards in their graveyard for various synergies, they could be using this style of effect to mill themselves. They could also be using the style of effect to mill the opponent. And when you're milling, you're specifically taking cards from the library and putting it into the graveyard. There are some effects that force a player to take cards from their library and put them into exile. Some people will refer to that as mill as well, simply because you are attacking the library. And so generally, a tactic that is attacking the library rather than the health total is referred to as a mill strategy. The reason that's relevant for new players out there is because when you run out of cards and the first time the game requires you to draw a card and you are unable to because you do not have any cards left in your library, you immediately lose the game. So if some player is able to completely eradicate your 60 card library using this style of effect, they win the game. There's certain decks out there that are capable of doing it more efficiently than others, and that is Mill. Mill's an interesting case. Unlike every other term that we're talking about today, Mill has actually been so widely adopted, and the effect has been so widely accepted as just a core tenet of Magic the Gathering that with M21, they officially made mill a keyword. So the word mill is actually present on Magic cards now, which is something that we haven't seen before, really. And you'll notice I'm not talking about other keywords. I'm not talking about scry, I'm not talking about surveil, because those are fairly self-explanatory, and frankly, there are hundreds of them. So it would take a very long time to cover all of them. But yeah, so mill is a unique case because it started as a colloquialism. It started as the community coming up with a name for this particular game action or this game effect. And 27, 28 years later, however many, after that, Wizards made it official, which is actually kind of neat. So I like that. So Mill's a fun case. Next up, we have one that I've included in this list specifically because we're seeing it more and more, and that is Firebreathing. Now, you'll notice that this is actually a card called Firebreathing. Now, this is from Mirage. It's been reprinted a handful of times in some core sets. The card itself is pretty lackluster. It's an enchantment for 1 where you can then pay an additional 1 red, and enchanted creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. This is also an effect that you see on a number of creatures. You'll see cards like Shivan Dragon, for example, has this effect. It is casually referred to as Firebreathing after this enchantment. The reason that I pointed out here is there are a number of dragons that have been printed even into standard right now that have Firebreathing on them. And so if you hear someone refer to the ability to pay mana to buff the power of a creature as Firebreathing, this is what they mean. And if you hear someone say, "Oh, that card is a 4 or 5 or 6 that has Firebreathing," this is what they mean. You can pay traditional Firebreathing is 1 red, and the result is +1/+0. There are some instances where you can pay like 1 generic and it gets +1/+0, which is pretty great. There are other instances where you pay 2 generic and you get +1/+0 or +2/+0. There are a lot of different variants, but at the end of the day, if you are spending mana to buff power until end of turn, a lot of the time that is referred to as Firebreathing. And then the last one that I want to talk about today is Drain. Drain effects are usually when you force your opponent to lose life and you gain life. And it was originally named after the card Drain Life. Drain style effects a lot of time appear in black, like almost exclusively, because black does a lot of stuff manipulating life totals, and so being able to manipulate your opponent's life total is pretty great. We see it on cards like Drain Life, of course. We also see it on cards like Grey Merchant of Asphodel, which is a very, very common one, as well as things as simple as Serrated Scorpion that just when it dies, it just drains your opponent. Because this effect is very, very useful because it not only hurts your opponent, but is also buffing your life total. So if you drain your opponent for 2, it's a 4-point life swing, which is very relevant. Keeps you around longer and gets your opponent closer to death, which is, of course, the goal, right? So that's the idea. If you hear someone refer to drain, usually they mean the loss of life followed by the gaining of life from the effects controller. So that's what that means. So this has been just a quick discussion of Magic terminology. Like I said, this is intended for new players, so feel free to use this as a resource. And if you have any questions about what other phrases that you've heard people use, please let me know down in the comments below. I'd be more than happy to put more of these videos together where we dive into those. There are a lot of esoteric words around like the color combinations and names of certain types of cards. A lot of those have become kind of unique. There are also a ton of cards that have nicknames that have for some reason stuck. Some of which have reasonable stories that make total sense. Other ones, it's like, I don't know, that one's just Steve now. Anyway. But thank you so much for checking out the video. I appreciate it very, very much. Keep an eye out on the channel for future reference videos like this. Please hit that subscribe button so you can be made aware of new stuff coming out. I also stream over on Twitch, twitch.tv/hamhocks42, where we are playing all kinds of stuff over on MTG Arena, getting silly with all kinds of different decks every day. So thank you so much. I appreciate you, and I will catch you on the next one.